And 3, 2, 1, we are live. I'm just going to ramble for a few minutes while I make sure that you can see and hear me, since there's a little bit of a delay on the video stream. And there we go. I think we should be all set. So yeah, just let me know, somebody pop up and tell me if you can hear me. I love that so many of you are tuning in from all over the world. It's always cool to see a little peek into your world. You know, you're saying good morning from Australia and good evening from, elsewhere. And here in chilly northern British Columbia, Canada, we are just finishing up lunch. And so I've still got half a day to go. And so hi, everyone. And oh, you can hear me loud and clear. Excellent. Great. So we'll get started. This is my Watercolor Beginner Bootcamp, was how I titled it when I started promoting this event. This is a free live watercolor workshop. But the more I think about the words bootcamp, the less I like it. Generally, when we think of the word bootcamp, we think negative. Like, think working hard and straining every muscle and just battling through. And I don't want to paint in watercolor like that. I want to have fun, relax, and enjoy the process. So I've been calling it my watercolor splash course. And that's a little more of what I'm all about. Diving in, getting your brush wet, and exploring this amazing and beautiful medium. So we're going to just start with an introduction. I'm going to tell you about what the course is about, what this workshop is about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, a little bit about watercolor, and then we're going to take a look at supplies and some of the very basic techniques. As you are watching the broadcast, feel free to ask questions using the chat here in YouTube. My friend Nina, she's 90% friend and 10% complete stranger because we haven't officially met. She lives in Croatia, and she's here today to follow your questions, and she'll transmit those to me via the magic of the internet so that I can answer them at the end of the broadcast. That just helps me to be able to focus on presenting my material really efficiently. And then also, if there are technical issues, she can help field those and send me panic texts and so forth. So welcome to all of you who are here today. What you can expect in this workshop: this is 3 days of 1-hour lessons, and each day we're doing it in 2 sessions. So if you didn't make the morning broadcast, this is a repeat of that broadcast. If you were here for the morning broadcast, I'm not going to tell you anything I didn't tell you in the lesson this morning. So you can go actually do some painting instead of watching me. There is a recording available, so you can watch this again if you feel like you missed some content because you were busy in the chat or whatever. You can watch the material over again. And so you can watch that recording anytime. And you can even share it with somebody if you'd like. Although ideally, along with this broadcast, you should have received in your inbox information on a little bit about what my view of watercolor. I've got a download to supplies, what watercolor supplies you should choose, which ones are good, a little bit about watercolor supplies if you're feeling overwhelmed by choosing materials. That's sent in a download. I also have just some other tutorial stuff that I'd love to share with you. So if you are stumbling upon this video somehow and have not received that content, please email me, info@angelafair.com, and I can hook you up with that information. I'm not really selling anything today. I really am just here to talk about my love of watercolor and share that with you. I started talking about doing this free beginner workshop, and I thought, well, usually people do this as kind of a promotion. So you would take this little piece of lessons, and then there's the big sales push at the end. And I don't really have a product to sell you today. I will tell you a little bit about some upcoming events, but I'm really just here to talk about watercolor. I believe that if you love watercolor and you get addicted to it, you're gonna look for the right instruction, the right support for your watercolor journey. And maybe that's me, maybe it isn't. Either way, I just want you to love your artistic journey. My goal has always been to encourage and educate students so that you can become your own favorite artist, just like I have. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. And I have a slideshow to go with that. So just bear with me as I click over to that screen. in a very inefficient way. There we go, loading. Okay, so we're in the splash course, the basics of watercolor, and I just want to tell you a little bit about who I am and my watercolor journey. When I was not quite 18 years old, I took my very first watercolor class and fell in love with the medium. I was in this, I think it was an 8-week evening class, so it was like 8 sessions, taught by a local artist, Edna McPhail, who's since passed away, and she was a powerhouse in our northern British Columbia community. And her and the other students in the class, who were mostly her friends and mostly all grandma types, they just took me under their wing. They were so excited to have this teenage girl who loved watercolor. And they loaned me good paper when my paper was, when they saw that I was using just the worst quality supplies, and gave me that foundation in watercolor that I needed. I believe good technique is the foundation that creative self-expression can come from. And so I was able to get that from that very first course. Back then, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have YouTube. And so when I wanted to grow my skills after that workshop, I was forced to be self-taught. And I actually think that every artist is self-taught, because no matter what instruction you're receiving, you are the one who has to implement it, who has to make it your own, who has to grow those skills. And so for, I think, 2 years in that early watercolor journey, I sat on my couch, I painted almost every night, and built my skills through trial and error, mostly error. And so that was the foundational skills that I needed. Developing my style took much longer. And I think for a while I thought maybe I would be a botanical artist and paint those really realistic and detailed florals. And I still love florals, but then I felt like my heart came alive when I started painting in a loose and fluid style. In 2013, I taught my very first online course, and it was so exciting to realize that my passion for articulating technique and sharing my love of watercolor was connecting with people all over the world. And since then, I've been able to teach people all over the world. I've been able to travel and really just build a community of fellow like-minded watercolor lovers. We're all at different stages, different paths on the journey, but I've learned that even after 20 plus years of painting, it is my birthday today, I'm 42, so I'm at like 24 years of painting. I've learned that I'll always be a learner. There's no peak where I'm going to feel like, oh, I've learned everything there is to learn and it's just all like a level playing field from here. There's, you're always challenging yourself, looking for that truer self-expression, that more confident wielding of skill, just getting what's in your heart out on the paper. And most of all, that comes out of a love of watercolor. And I truly believe that there's just no more beautiful medium than watercolor. So that's a little bit about me. I've mentioned already about the workshop. My slides are out of order here, or maybe it's just me. And so we are going to, over the next 3 days, you're going to have, like I said, an hour today lesson, 1 hour tomorrow, and then an hour again on Friday. And we're going to be just working through the techniques. And I love that we're doing it over 3 days. It gives me a little more time to present material to you and to show you the techniques and how they're used in action. We are going to look at supplies today. And I also have a guide to help you learn as a self-taught artist that I'll be sharing. I believe it's actually going out in your email. If not, I'll make sure it does at the end of the session. And we'll close with the question and answer session. Feel free to leave your questions in the chat and Nina will take those down. Okay, watercolor. What's the first thing that somebody told you about watercolor when you started painting? Was it negative by any chance? Did they say something like, oh, watercolor is the hardest medium? Did they maybe tell you that you can't fix mistakes in watercolor? Both of those things are things that I've heard as a watercolor artist, and generally they are the first thing that you hear. And yeah, say yes in the chat if that's something that people have said to you about watercolor, something that you've thought, or that maybe first scared you off. It really makes me sad when the nature of watercolor, the special magic of watercolor, is spoken of in those negative terms. I think the qualities that watercolor has far outweigh the potential for seeing it as a problem, I guess. And that's kind of who I am and how I teach. If you have a problem, there's always a flip side of opportunity. And we'll talk about that more. When you say that you can't fix mistakes in watercolor, maybe instead we should be looking at it as watercolor being transparent means that nothing can be hidden. It's not that you can't fix mistakes in watercolor, it's that it's an honest medium. The battle that you have, if you're having a mental battle as you're painting or a lack of confidence, it shows in your brushstrokes. And that's amazing to me. You can create these depths as you build up layers, and your emotional connection to the work really, really matters. And that's pretty powerful. Another thing people say is that it's the hardest medium, and what they mean is it's the hardest medium to control. And this fight for control often characterizes the early stages of learning watercolor. Watercolor is alive. Have you ever sat beside a little babbling brook and heard the water just singing over the rocks? It felt alive, didn't it? I'm looking forward to spring runoff in a few weeks or months, when the snow will melt and the water runs through the forest down to the river. And that's how it feels. It just feels like this life that comes to the earth when that water starts to run. And watercolor is the same way. I love to consider that when I'm painting with watercolor, I'm collaborating between the paint and the water and myself. It has to be in harmony for it to flow well. And it adds this unexpected joy and mystery that I wouldn't get if it was just all about me. So those are just pluses that I think are so amazing. The other thing that you might be asking yourself, and this is a question, this is something you might ask yourself rather than something somebody might tell you. And that question is, do I have what it takes? I thought this when I was 17, taking that first watercolor course. Do I have what it takes to be an artist? Something I desperately wanted. Am I good enough to call myself an artist? Do I have what it takes? Can I learn this? And if you are here today, which you are, it's because you love watercolor and you yearn to paint. You are the only one who can give yourself permission to actually go and do that. At some point in my artistic journey, I got to decide, yes, I am an artist, and I'm going to call myself an artist, and I'm going to pursue that path. And it was myself. I had to give myself permission to do that. Skill building, the act of getting confident in using the materials and learning these techniques and developing it, that is something that can be learned. And when you have that foundation of skill, then the creativity is the next step. And so when you have that mastery of skill, then you get to think about how you're going to implement and interpret it. We have to learn to walk before we can run. We give a toddler a pencil. I always use this analogy. We give a toddler a pencil, we teach them how to form the letters of their name, and we have full confidence that at some point, no matter how unrecognizable those first scribbles are, they will be able to form the letters, to write their name, to develop a signature. We don't second guess that. We don't look at those early scrawls and go, well, I guess he just doesn't have what it takes. We know it's a skill that can be mastered, and watercolor technique is the exact same way. So we're going to look at those techniques right now. And again, reminder, ask questions, and I will get to those at the end of the broadcast. Okay, so here we go. Switching over to my work surface, we're going to take a look at supplies here. And there we go. Okay. Your love affair with watercolor really needs to be something that's on your mind and on your radar, because I think that when we love watercolor, just taking my jacket off so I have full movement here. When we love watercolor, it shows in what we do. Okay, I'm going to be, over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be showing you techniques, I'm going to be showing you materials, and I'm going to be giving you some opinions that I have about watercolor. And I want to stress that these are opinions. We can probably agree on the basic techniques, and I spilled my water here and it's soaking in everywhere. Okay, I think we can, most of the time, artists will agree on the basic techniques. It's different, like things like how to prepare your paper, whether you should use black or white in watercolor. Those are matters of opinion. And often you will hear somebody say a rule, a never do this or an always do this. And it can feel really limiting. I think it's good to know the rules. The old saying, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. So we learn the rules and then we decide what we're going to do with those rules. And the other thing I wanted to say, and we don't need to list them here, but every time I teach a workshop, I have a student who will come to me. Actually, I'm going to switch over to my camera because I want to look you in the eye when I talk about this. Every time I teach a workshop, I have a student come to me and say, something hurtful that an instructor said to them. And this just blows my mind. Why would an instructor want to discourage or diminish their students in any way? But I think that often it happens inadvertently. We don't realize we're passionate about sharing our hard-earned lessons. And so often the things that we say that might come across as diminishing really aren't intentionally that way. So if I say anything, I always tell students, if I say anything during a workshop that makes you feel that way, makes you feel small or foolish or diminished in any way, please tell me. I don't want to go there. And again, I do share the rules. You can do with those rules what you like. You could throw them completely out and go your own way. And I will be proud of your freedom of self-expression. There's nothing more limiting than feeling tied up and bound by rules. So we take them with a grain of salt, and we take that, we find balance there. Okay, so back to the work surface. We're going to take a look at the supplies here. And again, sharing my opinions about supplies and my thoughts. So we have, generally you'll see watercolor, it comes in tubes or pans. And so these are tubes. And a pan would be, these are half pans actually. These are two little travel palettes. One's made by Core, Q-O-R. And this one's made by Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith just came out with these. And these actually come with empty pans, so you can fill them with your own favorites as well, which I kind of like that possibility. What you will see is these pans, these half pans, are tiny. Where'd that little extra one go? Here it is. Very small. In comparison, gram for gram, milliliter for milliliter, ounce for ounce, however you want to measure it, the price difference between pans and tubes, you're going to get a better deal when you buy tubes. It's just the way it is. Brand-wise, there are a lot of good brands out there. Some brands make student grade and artist grade. Daniel Smith doesn't. They just make one grade of paint. You know what you're getting is the same thing the professional artists use. If you have purchased student grade paints, use them and enjoy them. When you start to feel like you are missing out, when you start to notice a difference and feel like you need to upgrade, that's a good time to upgrade. So don't feel like you need to start with artist quality paint. You do want paint that provides rich saturation of color. Some of the colors that you'll get in a student grade are trying to remember the word to describe it. They're just not the same quality as the artist quality. They've used cheaper pigments to make that color, so they're not always going to be true to the colors that you see another artist using. And then there's all kinds of information on choosing paint, which colors to choose. One really good site for that is handprint.com. What I recommend is, rather than going out and buying a big set of many paints, what you would be better off doing is working with a small range of colors and really learning how to mix. So this set by Core, for example, comes with two yellows. There's kind of a cool yellow, lemon yellow, and a warm yellow. There's a warm red, kind of a tomato red, and a pinky red, cool red. And then we've got a cool turquoisey blue and a warmer kind of royal blue. And those 6 colors alone will give you a great range of color mixing possibilities and potential. It's nice to have a dark, like a Payne's gray or an indigo, so you can mix darker saturations of color. And it's nice to have a brown. I like burnt umber. It makes really nice grays. Burnt sienna works as well. And the more time you spend getting to know your colors and mixing them, the more confident you'll be as an artist. I personally own over 100 different hues of watercolor. I have a really big palette that I often use, but I never use all of those colors at the same time. I'm still going to work with a small range of half a dozen colors in a painting situation. Okay, well, I see Christina has mentioned that good watercolor paper is an absolute must, and I must say that this is something I agree with. And we'll talk about why right now. If you are learning watercolor, do you want to learn the easy way or the hard way? And unfortunately, learning the easy way means spending a little bit more money for good quality watercolor paper. Artist quality paper has a better flow of evenness, and I'm going to show you this right here. I painted this background for this tulip earlier this morning, and this is on a cheaper grade of paper, student grade. The student grade paper generally has a little bit of a slippery feel, and the drying time seems to be more uneven. And so I really, with all my experience, as 24 years of painting experience, I really didn't get a nice smooth transition. I couldn't, and I wouldn't have even tried to get a flat, even, perfectly even background. I have watermarks here. It's lighter in this area. It's lighter here. There's a bit of an edge showing in this area. Here my thumb actually touched and left a mark. So it's really unforgiving, this paper, as I'm trying to create this smooth background. It just didn't want to cooperate. What you want to look for when you're buying paper is a few little words. You want to look for 100% cotton. Cellulose blends, they're the ones that are going to fight you. And then you want to pay attention to the weight. 140 pound or 300 GSM is a really nice weight of paper. It's like a thicker cardstock. And I wouldn't buy anything with a smaller number than 140 pound. It just gets too thin and then it wants to buckle as you're painting. And then the other thing I do if I can is I like to open up the pad if they let me at the store and just give the paper a feel. If it feels a little bit like peach fuzz, has that little bit of toothy texture, I know it's going to be a more cooperative paper, because there have been just a few times where I've bought 100% cotton paper and it felt slippery or slick to my fingers, and it did not perform as nicely as this cold press kind of textured toothy paper. Cold press is the texture of the paper. It's also, if you're in the UK, it might be called knot, N-O-T, as in not hot press and not rough. It's the cold press. It's right in the kind of the middle between that. Rough is going to be more textured. I don't know, like elephant skin or something. I don't have a comparison, but it generally shows more of the granulation of the pigment, a little more sedimentary qualities, and the pigment settles down into the hollows of the paper a little bit more. And hot press is very smooth, and for me, I just don't feel super comfortable using it. It just doesn't flow the same way as the cold press that I'm used to. Try out samples. Many brands will give you sample packs of their paper to try, and so you don't just have to buy Arches, which has been around since 1492. It's easy to remember when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's right there actually on the lid cover of the block. You can also, if you're wanting to save money on paper, there are some brands that I find are a little more affordable that I like. Cheap Joe's makes a Kilimanjaro paper, which is, I actually think it's quite nice. I also have this Blick cold press watercolor block. Blocks people find really handy because they're gummed on 4 sides. So you don't need to worry about your paper buckling as you paint. You can just paint right on the surface. When you're done, run a palette knife or a letter opener right down this little slit here, and just remove the paper from the block. Blocks are the most expensive way to buy watercolor paper, however, because they have been specially prepared. This is a pad. It's just gummed on one side, and I guess this is my last sheet of it. And this is really nice. This is what I use when I teach a workshop, just because it's so convenient, and then all the students have the same size. Or you can buy full sheets of watercolor paper, which is your best value. They are usually 22 by 30 inches. and you can tear or cut them down to the size you want to use. I'll usually divide them into at least 4 pieces. That gives me 8 painting opportunities if you're using both sides, which I always do. And yeah, just the best value for your money. Arches also makes a big roll of paper that's 42 inches wide, I think, by 10 yards. So you can really spread out, but it's and it is the best value for your money, but because it's so inconvenient to cut it down to size, I tend to avoid my roll unless I want to make a really big painting. I don't want to wrestle with it or risk it getting dirty as I'm rolling it out to cut. So that's just a little overview of paper. If you have bought student grade paper and you're looking at it and thinking, what am I going to do with all this terrible paper that Angela just said is awful, use it anyhow. Just be aware that when you are using student grade paper, you will develop strategies for compensating for its shortcomings that are unnecessary when you're working with the better paper. You might get used to the fact that a cheaper paper lifts really easily, so that when you make a mistake, you can use a paper towel to scrub it off. And then when you go to a paper that's a little more absorbent and better quality, you're going to struggle to relearn some of those techniques. So it can actually make things more difficult for you down the road. I always say really using good paper, even if your paintings aren't turning out, is still usually less than what we might spend on cafe coffee in a week, or think of your other little indulgences. Some people say cheaper than therapy, and watercolor creativity, of course, is really good for your mental health. It is worth it. When I think about what I spend on personal health, taking care of my body, exercise, eating the right foods, and of course taking care of my hair and makeup and all of that stuff, really taking care of my mental health by spending a little bit of extra money on art supplies is worth it. And I do watch for sales for paper. Okay, so I've really beaten this paper thing to death. We'll move on. I want to show you my very favorite brush. This is my Escoda Versatile number 10 Rigger. There is a link to the supplies I'm talking about in the description below the video if you have not received it in your inbox. This brush I love. It has a fine point so I can paint detail, a wide body so I can fill large areas by using the side of the brush. Whoop. It's a synthetic brush. It doesn't have any animal fibers in it. However, it has the softness of the squirrel or the sable brushes that were previously, the artist's gold standard. So there are some really good synthetic brushes out there. The Escoda Versatile are one of them. I also like this little Scroggy's Loose Goose Dagger Striper, it's called, made by Cheap Joe's Art Stuff. I love the shape of the body of it here and how it makes beautiful fine lines. So those are the 2 brushes I use all the time, the ones I love. Experiment with brushes. Try to use a bigger brush when you're painting. It'll help you stay loose and relaxed rather than getting fussy and overworking your paintings. That's one strategy that most professional artists will tell you that they do. They use the biggest brush they can get away with, and it helps them to paint with the big picture more in mind. Okay, great comments in the chat about supplies, recommendations on paper, how to get a good bargain. So make sure to take a look at that. I'm going to take a drink of water and then we'll do some painting. So we're going to do a little bit of prepping for tomorrow's lesson right now by doing some painting wet and wet. And I know you've heard the term wet and wet before. This is not the first time. Wet and wet is an early stage technique. And most of the time, well, it's a small dose or a big dose technique. We're going to do a big dose of it right now. And I like having a spray brush or a spray bottle on hand. And I've taped my paper to my board right now. My spray bottle has given up on me. I have another one. Okay, so we're just moistening the entire paper. Just a note, this is the same paper that was in the Arches pad, and I have taped it to a corrugated plastic board. This I just bought at a sign shop. Coroplast is another name. I'm not sure if it's the same thing as Gator board, it might be. Or you can steal a realtor or an election sign, it's the same thing. Okay, I'm not advocating theft, I'm sorry. Okay, so I've just misted my entire paper. Because it's taped down, it should stay relatively flat and not buckle too much. I do not stretch my paper. My opinion is that modern watercolor paper doesn't need to be stretched. Back in the day, you used to need to remove some of the sizing in your stretching by soaking the paper, and then you'd have to let it dry again before you could paint on it. We don't need to go to those lengths, although there are some artists who still swear by that technique. It's really up to you and your working preferences. I just want to start painting, so I don't like wasting time with stretching. I just want to get paint on my paper. So here I am. And when you paint for the love of it, you don't want to waste time prepping stuff. You just want to go for it. I'm just blotting the edges of my paper right now so there aren't any puddles. I want an even amount of moisture. My paper is shiny. The moisture tends to migrate into one place. If the paper buckles a bit, it might buckle or go into the hollows of that buckle. So I like to tilt my board just a little bit to encourage any excess moisture to move to the bottom of the paper. The edges of my painting will dry faster than the middle. Basic, that's like physics or something, I think. And so I'm aware of that as well. And I'm continually paying attention to the amount of moisture on my paper so that I can better gauge what painting techniques to use. I have 2 water containers here, and I'm just going to mix a little bit of lovely pinky red color here using quinacridone coral today and opera pink. And I clean my brush in this one. I rinse it in this one. I always have clean water for my mixes over here. And then I usually take the biggest drips off my brush so that my brush is loaded but not dripping. So I call that a juicy brush. And then we put some paint on our paper. And this is the fun part. And for many, many years, I used to tell my students, with watercolor, it dries quickly, so you need to work fast. And watercolor does dry quickly, especially if you're comparing it to oils. But if you think work quickly, I think we often think rush, and I don't want you to rush. Relax. So we think slow, we plan in our heads, and then we go into action. So I've planned where I'm going to be placing my pinks, approximately to make some flowers. I think simple objects, flowers or fruit, are a really good place to focus your early learning attention and to try out some techniques. As you can see, because I'm tilting my paper, the paint is running down. And this is also the wettest part of my paper. Water equals movement in watercolor. So the more water we're using, the more the color is going to move. If we have less water, things don't tend to move in quite the same way. Let's grab some green gold. Oh, and the yellow I was using is Hansa Yellow Light. I'm just going to grab some green gold and drop some of that in. And we let the colors mix and mingle on the paper. I don't do a lot of mixing in my palette because I love this kind of organic movement. And the green gold is going to give us this beautiful sunlit look, very yellow. I can pick up some water with my brush if I want things to move more and just kind of guide it into the painting. And I work with a light touch. Anytime I'm painting in watercolor, I'm not mashing my brush into the paper, keeping my movements light and very gentle. I like to tell, when I'm teaching students at the school, junior high students, I'll tell them to think of their paintbrush as a baby bunny and treat it with the same amount of gentleness. Okay, so I kind of like this path of pink down the center, so I'm debating whether or not I should keep it, but it might cause trouble for me later. What we're doing right now as we paint this wet and wet beginning And here I'm using just the lightest touch. Everything's so moist in this area that I can just very, very lightly touch my brush to the paper and see the movement start to happen. Okay, I was going to say something and I've completely forgotten what it was. Oh yeah, planning. Okay, so we're planning ahead. And what happens is so often I'll see a new painter who's put extensive detail into an object on their paper and completely failed to plan a background. And I have kind of an example here. This is a 50% example, I guess, because there is a bit of a background down below here. But here we've painted these detailed fruits and they're on a white background, which gives it a little bit of an unfinished look. And sometimes the white background is exactly what the painting needs. But when you've gone to this amount of trouble to paint your painting, and then you have to paint the background, you might run into some problems. And so we're going to talk about that in just a second, but I want to just spend a minute observing our wash here first. And as I've placed and filled my paper and let that color flow, I'm aware of a couple things. One is that my paint is going to dry about 15 to 20% lighter than it goes down. So this wash feels a little bit bright for a first layer for a background, but it'll soften and the paint continues to work as long as the painting is drying. And excuse me. So as long as the painting is wet, we have things happening. The magic is continuing, and that's pretty special. So we can pause and observe. I don't just walk away, even though I'm done putting brush to paper. I need to watch it for a little while. Parts of the paper are losing their shine, and as that shine disappears, I know that it's time to let that part of the painting be, and we'll talk about that a bit tomorrow. The other thing I look for is these pools of water that might gather in a few places, in the low places or around the edges. And I like to blot those up just by wiping those edges. And sometimes if that hollow is in towards the middle of the page, you might even use a thirsty brush, just like a sponge, to lift excess moisture. When there is an imbalance of moisture, that is when blooms are created. And I have an example here somewhere. This one, so many blooms. Okay, so on this piece of paper, you can see right along here this edge that's created. That's because there was more water on the edge of the paper than there was on this side. And so that excess water pushed against this drying wash and created an edge where those two differing ratios of water to pigment were fighting with each other. We have some here. We have another one here where this color, the wetter red, bled out into the background. And those edges are very demanding on the eye. When we have edges, there's an edge here, there's an edge here, here. When we have a crisp edge, which is here, very controlled, crisp and smooth edge, that comes from painting wet paint on a dry paper. All of those edges demand attention. Our eye goes to those boundaries. So we want them to be in the places that we like. When there's an edge that's off, somewhere else, away from the focal point, it can distract the entire painting and derail it. So we want to be intentional about where we place our edges. Blooms can be so beautiful. I actually really like this one. But we have to be able to know why they happen so that we can decide, we can be the ones who kind of manipulate or intend it to go to those places. So as this is drying, I watch for those puddles so that I don't get blooms in places that I don't want to see them. And I think we're at the stage where I can probably set this aside and leave it to dry. So we're going to set that aside and talk a bit about edges. So coming back to this and looking quickly at my notes. Yep, we're on track, we're good. I want to talk about Some watercolor techniques, and I want to talk about that planning that we're doing. So the very first wash we did today, we're going to use tomorrow. This is the one we did this morning. It takes a couple hours to dry. I don't like to use a blow dryer because I feel that allowing the water and paint time to do their own thing just keeps that magic happening. Sometimes using a blow dryer, I feel like it doesn't, you lose some of that freshness. So that's my own personal preference. Again, try it and see what works for you. I like taking the time while things are drying to think and plan my next move, thinking slow so I can paint quickly. When you've painted that initial background, you're often going to see a better result, and we'll demonstrate that now. So here I have my fruits, and they need a background, so I'm going to paint that in. And this is good paper, so I know that I should be able to make a nice fluid, soft wash. So I'm going to just go right up around my pear here, and very carefully with my brush pull out the color that I need. And I like to work from one spot, because if I paint this little bit of blue here and then I move over and paint more, if this dries, I get an edge. So I like to just keep growing this wet area with my brush. But I'm going to also show you, I'm trying to be very careful not to overlap with my fruit or my other background, and I'm deliberately going over because I want to show you what happens. We'll get there. I want to keep growing this area, not letting any edges dry. And I don't want to run out of color here, because that's another thing that happens when you're painting. If you run out of color, then you're in trouble. So I like to always add to my puddle when I'm going back and forth. So I'll show you that in a second. So I just grab more paint, that decreased the amount of paint in there. So when I go back in the next time, I grab a little water with my brush, I grab a little bit of paint, and I go back in. And you're always topping it up. And this is even more important if you've specially mixed a particular color. If I had mixed that as a gray, I'd continually be adding from my base colors, so that if the color changes over time, it doesn't change dramatically. Where you run out and you create this new mixture and it's not the same. So half your paintings with, one type with the first mixture of color and the other halves with the other, and that's no good. What you want to do instead is be continually topping up that mixture, so that if it changes, it's very gradual and doesn't have that same amount of impact. And now this paper really cooperated quite well with me. It's got a nice evenness to it. And so that's really nice. But I want you to take a look at the areas where I accidentally overlapped with my brush. Here, and here, and here. And actually over here as well. And how much darker that made the fruit in those areas. Suddenly it doesn't have that same smooth transition that I would have if I'd started with a soft background. Maybe I'd painted my blue first and dropped in a little bit of color, or just created a softer edge with a white area for that fruit to go in. So I really like planning ahead so that my background is thought about from the very first stage of the painting. It just makes your painting flow so much better. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, we're going to take a look at a couple ways to use water in your painting. We're going to talk about a flat wash and a graded wash. I've found when I'm teaching a workshop and a student asks me how to paint something, my answer is always the same. It's, well, it depends, because there's never just one way to paint anything. And that's good news. So you can try out techniques and use the ones that are most comfortable for you. So these are the samples that I painted in our morning workshop. We're just going to go down below and do them again. First, we want to plan out a flat wash, which is basically what I did in my previous demonstration with the fruit here. Just filling an area with a smooth transition of color. And this is actually one of the hardest things to master when you're new to watercolor, because you need to have a juicy amount of pigment so that everything flows smoothly. If your brush is too dry, you're going to see lines. And if your brush is too wet, you might see half the color migrate to one end of the section. We don't want either of those. So this is something you want to be practicing all the time. And the good news is you don't have to do it in boring old swatches. You can do it in painting skies. Oh, that's the wrong way to go about this. You can just explore wet and wet effects in different ways and creating flat washes in different ways. I'm going to moisten now one area of my paper, and this is the same thing we did with our very first wet and wet wash. By wetting this area of the paper, I can then touch color in. Now what this does, I get more movement. You can see the color instantly flows, but I also get a little more unpredictability because not only is my paper wet, but my brush is wet. So I'm actually doubling the amount of moisture on the paper when I use this method. And that's where you get, like I said, tilting it here allows more color to migrate and flow. So it's a little bit more unpredictable. But it does give you more time to work with this color. So if I decided I wanted to maybe change up the color a little bit, grab some indigo and just darken it a bit, I have a little more time to do that. So that's a good thing to know about. Wetting the paper first gives you an extended drying time. The other thing we do is we have a graded wash where we might start with one rich stroke of color. And I've got so much pigment on my brush right now, it feels almost sticky. I'm going to rinse my brush, and then using a loaded brush, it's loaded with water, I can then pull down color from that first line and create a nice transition, and we would call this a graded wash. And the cool thing about a graded wash, and I could keep going, I'd probably have to go all the way to the bottom of the page to get this color all the way down to white. The cool thing about a graded wash is you can use that in miniature, like I've done here, to blend two different colors. So I have a flower petal, for example, start out with that beautiful coral, and then I might choose my Hansa yellow and create a line here. And I can do this two ways. I could start on this side and pull the color over, or I could start on that side and then add water to meet those two colors together. And using a very gentle touch, I can kind of nurse those colors around too. I don't have to just touch them in and leave them. I have a little bit of time to work with the colors, and that gives a really pretty yellow and the transition to the peachy color in the middle. One thing I've noticed with the quinacridone coral, and some colors do this more than others, is if I drop excess moisture in, this one's still pretty damp, so it might not give us the effect we want. We're just going to just put a drop of water on each of these washes and create that imbalance of moisture. And when we create that imbalance, and this one's almost dry, so I don't think it's going to do too much. This one's creating a little bit of a blotch there. You can see it's not even anymore. This one would probably do the most, except for I still have a little bit of time here. It's still damp enough that I can keep moving the color around. This is a skill thing. This is the teaching a child to write their name and they don't even know how hard to press the pencil down to the paper at first. This is where you're at. If you're painting, you're going to be observing and taking in some informational stuff that will help you to know and anticipate what's going to happen. While everything is shiny and moist, I have working time. I have time to develop my painting. Once it starts to dry and lose its sheen, that's when I lose that flexibility in my painting. So now I've got a lot of moisture here. I know I have time to adjust those colors. It's when they start to lose that shine and that's happening. There we go. Then I start to see if I'm going to fuss, it's going to make things worse. And I dropped in color there, and it's pushing the yellow and the pink around. And I might say, oh no, I'm going to lift that off. And then I get this blotch that was created with my paper towel, and I just can't win. Fighting with watercolor generally doesn't work. It wants to do what it wants to do. We learn how to cooperate with it. So hopefully that helps you to just relax. Usually things can't be fixed in a rush. We learn how to accommodate watercolor, and we'll be talking about that again tomorrow. I'm going to move over to your questions here. Tomorrow we're going to develop our wet and wet wash, that beautiful background we created. So if you want to do one of those or 5 or 6 of those, I'm going to encourage you to do that. Just work with a wet paper, dropping in color, and seeing what happens. Make that time to observe. Okay, just a sec. The sun is out and all kinds of sun is coming in. It's gorgeous. And we're going to just switch over to your question. I know there's a whole bunch, and I wanna answer them. So tomorrow we'll be talking. My topic is common problems and struggles and how to deal with them. If you are fighting with watercolor and need an intervention, I'm going to talk to you about some ways to fix mistakes. And we're going to spend a little bit of time developing, working out some techniques on that first layer wash. Lots of questions here, and I'm going to answer as many as I can. Let's see here. Evie asks, how do you store and organize your tubes of paint? Organizational questions should really be directed to somebody else. I do not have great storage techniques really to offer you. I fill my palette with my paint, and then each color I have a section, a storage box for red, I have a storage box for green, etc. So the tubes go in there, and a special storage box for like shiny iridescent colors. Jean comments, I watched the earlier screening. You said you usually buy a year's supply of paper, and I wonder how you store it to prevent the loss of surface viability. I have not experienced the loss of sizing in that kind of time period. I know they talk about sometimes really old watercolor paper, the sizing breaks down somehow and it doesn't flow evenly. I have never experienced that with the paper that I have. I think most of the time when that happens, you're looking at paper that's like 10 years old or older, but it very possibly depends on your climate as well. I store my paper out of the sun, and that's really all there is to it. Yvonne's, Arches Full Sheets has a textured logo that seems like it would show up. Should I tear that edge off? Professional watercolor artists that I know are not afraid to let the Arches logo show in their paintings. Where this might be an issue is if you're painting a really small, like postcard size paper, and that watermark is like dead center on the paper, that's going to be an issue. But most of the time, if you're painting, to a decent size, that logo, so often artists just keep that on the paper. It's not a big deal. Yvonne says, I have Sennelier paint and La Fontaine paper as I'm in France. Is Sennelier good quality? I really like Sennelier paint, actually, yes. I have not tried the paper. Jay Wall says, Core is quite a bit more expensive per milliliter than other options in the US. Does it go further? Core, I find, is very, very saturated. The colors are very bright and they don't lose intensity as they dry. So it might last longer. I don't know. I haven't really compared prices. I wouldn't say like, oh, this is the best paint of all time and this is the one you should go with. Really, again, try it, use it. If you love it, then make it your brand. I have a very personal connection to Daniel Smith. I have other brands, but I feel like Daniel Smith is my paint, and I was so honored to become one of their brand ambassadors last year. I'm looking forward to having my very own dot card this year, later in this year. So that's kind of a cool little partnership. But I chose them because I feel a personal connection to the paint. It feels like my paint, and so I love it. Christina Todd says, I have a versatile rigger number 8. Will that be okay? Yes. When it comes to brushes, I have had some brushes for decades before I've really learned how to use and enjoy them. The Cheap Joe's rigger or dagger striper that I showed you, I had it for, I'm sure, 5 years at least before I really started to use it and love it. So whatever brush you love and feels like the one for you, use it. Try out different things. Evie says, I've reviewed my papers. They list weight, cold press, etc., but nothing is listed about content. So would you assume that the content is mostly wood pulp? Yes. Actually, this is the devious little thing that the paper companies do. If it's not 100% cotton, they won't tell you that it's not 100% cotton. They'll just conveniently omit that information. So if it's 100% cotton, they're going to brag about it. It's going to be on the cover somewhere. So that's something to be aware of. Sue asks, is there any advantage to wetting the back of your paper also? If you're working wet and you're in a climate where things are drying very quickly, then yes, absolutely. Wet the back and it'll stay wet even longer. It gives you more time to work with it. Great idea. Allison asks, do you suggest working or mixing right on the paper, even if you just have a limited palette? Or is that more if you have a lot of different colors to work with? Oh, that's a good question. Most of the time, when it comes to mixing paint, I don't have all the answers. When it comes to mixing paint, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll pick up, if I want a green, I'll pick up a little yellow, I'll pick up a little blue on my brush, and then as I paint, it mixes itself. And I do that, yeah, I mean, I'm always working with a limited palette because I'm choosing half a dozen colors, usually 4 to 6 colors for my paintings. And so I have to mix them. And most of the time I'm doing that right on the paper. What darker green color was there beside the green gold? I didn't explain that, did I? I chose a phthalo turquoise and mixed that with the yellow that I was already using to make my own green. Judith asks, do you ever use aquaboard or the equivalent when painting? That's not something I've tried yet. Cornelia asks about the brush I was using. Couldn't I have chosen a larger brush? Yes, and yet the bigger, there's this funny tension between when it comes to using large brushes, because if your brush is too big, it's going to hold so much moisture that you're just going to flood your paper. So I tend to just stick with that number 10 rigger pretty much all the time. Jay Wall asks, how would you have painted a background for the fruit that would allow for the color of the fruit to come out like it did on white paper? I would have planned, what I would have probably tried to do is really have planned out, if that fruit, if I have a yellow fruit, my wet and wet background is going to have yellow or really, really pale yellow in that position where that fruit is approximately going to be. Planning for those elements and putting that hint of the parent color, whatever that color is going to be, into your background really helps it to flow. EC Philharmonic says, I made a mistake, and after painting pinks, I dipped into blue instead of yellow and got the most beautiful shade of lavender. Oh, I hope you remembered which colors you used for that. It's so nice when you have that magical thing happen. How often, Angela, do you have these happy accidents? It's getting more and more for me. Like I can paint every time I paint, if I can see something in there to love and to say, oh, I really like that. And then I chase that thing, whatever it is that I really like. Listen to your heart when you're painting. And when that thing happens that you're like, oh, I really like that, try to do more of it. And it will get easier to do more of that as you continue painting. I think we think that when we're brand new to painting, we often think that, you have these amazing things that happen that first time when you have zero expectations. And then when you try to intentionally reproduce those magical things, then you start to struggle. And so we often get discouraged from that beginner's luck in the transitional phase to learning how to do it intentionally. And be patient. It's okay. It's the same for all of us. J Cat says, have you ever used Saunders Waterford paper? Yes, it's a good paper. It's just hard to get here in Canada. Okay, I think we're out of questions here. I wanted to just talk a little bit about what's going to happen tomorrow, what to expect. Like I said, we will be working on that wet and wet beginning that we started, and I'll be talking about problem solving. Watercolor is all about problem solving, and I'll be talking about that more tomorrow. But I also wanted to tell you about what's upcoming. Watercolor Mastery is coming up. It's my big, exciting, groundbreaking breakthrough course. It's where I teach students who are struggling to make the transition from painting to following an instructor and painting step by step to really developing your own personal style and voice as an artist. And it's a hard place to be in because it feels like, you're all alone in it. You're not all alone. I've been there. I'm not the only one who's been there, but I know a few things that can help you to make that transition from being that student who's really dependent on the guidance of your instructor to being able to be your own biggest advocate and coach and your own favorite watercolor artist. That's the goal here, to be a fearless, heart-led watercolor painter. I'll be sharing more about Watercolor Mastery and tools during Watercolor Mastery Enrollment Week. My throat's drying out. Watercolor Mastery Enrollment Week is March 5th to 12th, and during that week I'll be sharing how you can know if this is something that's right for you or not. I don't want you there if you're not ready. I don't want you to be overwhelmed or discouraged. But if you are ready to take that leap, I'm ready to be there to coach you through it. So I'll be sharing more about that down the road. There's info on how to sign up for that information session in the description below the video. I really want to thank you for joining me today and encourage you to come back tomorrow. I'm excited to share more with you. We can't cover it all in 3 lessons, but we're going to try, and it's going to be fun. So have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.